The Mig-27M flies into War Thunder in the new update with a whole bunch of advanced smart weapons at its disposal. Let's dive in and take a look. The original Mig-27 was introduced in the early 1970s and quickly found itself getting updates and revised models. The 27M was an upgraded model intended to balance technical capabilities against producibility. Remember, this thing was designed to fight World War III, so the Soviets wanted to make sure they could roll these things off the production lines quickly if it ever became a necessity. That ended up being a primary factor in the designs of a lot of their military hardware, and the 27M was no different. It had a variety of upgrades to its electronics that won't really make any difference in the game, stuff like radios and transponders. And something that does show up in the game, it introduced the GSH 630 cannon. And don't worry, we're going to get to that in a few minutes. The MiG-27 is redesigned from the MiG-23 in a few key areas to reflect its different mission. The air intakes are redesigned, and the engine exhaust nozzle, as well as a few other minor aerodynamic refinements, are also different. These were done to improve the low-level flight performance, since the MiG-27 didn't need to intercept bombers at high altitudes, it needed to blow things up down on the ground. As such, it was optimized for high-speed flight and a range at lower levels, instead of all the high-altitude performance that the MiG-23 needed. The nose was modified for better visibility against targets on the ground, giving the MiG-27 its distinctive drooped nose, which is the most obvious way to tell it apart from the MiG-23. To be very clear, the MiG-27M is a dedicated, fast-attack aircraft intended to destroy targets on the ground. It's not a fighter, and this is not an interceptor. The MiG-27 exists simply to use its ordnance against ground targets. Speaking of that ordnance, let's discuss the gun for a moment, because this is something unique. The 27M carries the GSH 630 6-barrel 30mm gas-operated rotary cannon. This monster has a rate of fire north of 5,000 rounds per minute, and its primary use wasn't aircraft. It was used primarily, and still is, as a close-in weapon system on naval vessels to shoot down cruise missiles and low-flying aircraft. This thing is such a beast that its insane rate of fire can actually damage the aircraft that fires it. This isn't modeled in the game or anything, but in real life, the GSH 630 caused such severe vibrations and recoil stress on the MiG-27 that if the pilot fired the gun for more than the briefest of instants, it would rattle the plane so bad that parts would sometimes just fall off. Equipment would fail, cockpit instruments would be damaged and their glass caps would crack, and sometimes there was even permanent structural damage to the airframe. This cannon is so brutal out in real life that firing it damaged the plane carrying it. But not as much as it damaged whatever it was pointed at. This monster pounds ground targets with almost 100 rounds a second. But there is a catch. The MiG-27 only carries 300 rounds of ammunition, which means you can only fire for a total of about 3 seconds, which leaves zero margin for error in aiming the gun. This is a problem, because in practice, you can only fire 2 or 3 bursts at most, and if you miss, you're empty. Scoop up, go home. Anything you actually hit is simply removed from existence, but you have to make sure that your shots count. So, yeah, trigger discipline. In terms of munitions, the MiG-27 gets an absolutely insane selection of loadouts, with a combination of bombs, rockets, gun pods, air-to-air missiles, air-to-ground missiles, and now even TV-guided bombs. There's a problem, though. The way they did the interface for the new weapons is rather clunky and kind of cumbersome. And we're going to talk about these new guided weapons a bit before we talk about their place in the game overall. Let's look at the bombs first. To understand the guided bombs, First, let's talk about regular dumb bombs. Please forgive the crappy artwork here, but I need to illustrate something and I couldn't find any good diagrams online to explain this. When you drop a dumb bomb, it flies in a very predictable flight path based on your speed and direction and your altitude and all that. Your ballistics computer, in planes that have them, and the Mig-27 does, updates your CCIP and gives you that accurate-ish brown tan colored target reticle on the ground showing you where your bombs are going to hit. The idea being to line up your plane and release the bombs just at the right moment as the brown tan target reticle is on top of what you want to hit. Generally speaking, you can do this from the external view, and it's usually easiest to do it from the external view, maybe tilting your camera a little if you have to see around your plane for a moment. Now, the smart bomb you get is the KAB-500. This is a TV-guided weapon that uses what is called a contrast sensor in the nose and control surfaces on the back to steer the bomb onto the target. The explosive mass of the bomb is not super high, and you'll need to aim these accurately, which is where the problems begin. To designate a target, you hit your keybind to change views and switch to the TV sensor. Then you have to use your mouse and keybinds to pick a spot, lock it, and drop the bombs. The problem is, switching to the TV sensor can be very disorienting, and it can take a few seconds or longer to figure out what you're looking at and to find the target you want to hit. Worse still, you're still flying forward with absolutely zero situational awareness while you're stuck in the TV sensor view. To make matters worse, if you take too long, you'll overshoot your target, and you won't even necessarily even realize that until it's far too late. Forgive the crappy diagram here again. The bomb can steer itself, but only so far. You have a zone on the ground that the bomb can steer itself to, and the target has to be inside that zone when you lock it and drop the weapon. As your plane moves forward, so does that zone of possible impact points. So you have to try and designate a target quickly before you fly past it and overshoot. To make matters more difficult, the TV sensor view is implemented very poorly, and it allows you to move the camera and targeting crosshairs far outside the zone you can actually hit. So you can find yourself wasting precious seconds, like while people are shooting at you, trying to designate a target that you can't actually attack. As far as I can tell, those vertical lines on the bottom of the TV view are supposed to indicate the target zone that you can hit. Meanwhile, you're tunnel visioned into this TV sensor and not flying your plane, while who knows what is happening around you and who knows who is vectoring in for a missile shot. As if these weapons weren't difficult enough to use already, the bombs don't track moving targets. You designate a position on the ground to hit, not a target to track. If, for example, you're attacking a tank, you have to hope that the tank doesn't move too far away before the bomb lands. To make matters even worse, clouds and smoke can make the weapon far less useful and will effectively block the targeting. The only real silver lining here is that this is a fire-and-forget weapon. After you drop the bomb, you can turn away and go do something else while the bomb continues down to its impact point. You can also sometimes get accurate hits if you drop it from a high altitude, but setting up the initial aim can be quite difficult. In comparison, the dumb bombs can be aimed with the CCIP from your external view, have comparable or better explosive yields, and you can carry more of them. You can also carry two TV-guided air-to-ground missiles, the KH-29T. These suffer many of the same difficulties as the bombs, but they're slightly easier to aim because they can fly forward and hit targets farther in front of the launching aircraft. You still have the problems of being tunnel visioned inside the TV sensor, but since the weapon fires forward, you're at a lower risk of overflying your intended target before you get the shot off. However, I don't recommend trying to use this on anything closer than 3 kilometers or so. The good news with the KH-29T is that if you can actually hit something with it, it's almost guaranteed to pop the target, because generally it's a good missile when you can hit with it. The MiG-27 can also take the familiar KH-23M. This is a manual command line-of-sight missile and has a smaller warhead than the MiG's other weapons, but if you're good at steering these in, you can still pop targets with them. I'm terrible with these things, but some people are good with them. You also get two laser-guided missiles, the KH-25ML and the KH-29L. The MiG-27 also has a new interface for using laser-guided missiles, and to be honest, it feels like a bit of a downgrade from how it used to be with the Su-17. With this new interface, you have to shift into a laser designator view similar to the TV sensor view, and then use your keybinds to lock a spot and fire the missile. The primary advantage of the laser-guided missiles over the TV-guided weapons is that you can manually steer them in and attack moving targets a bit more easily, but manually. And while you're working the laser, you're not flying your plane and losing a lot of situational awareness. You don't have to stay in the laser view, but if you don't, you can't steer the missile in against a moving target. Now, the laser has a little bit of wiggle room and can aim around a little bit. This isn't like the beam riding missiles on some other planes, and you don't have to continue to fly in a straight line directly at your target. You still have to fly in the same general direction of your target, and you still have to plan your flight attitude so that you can keep the intended target within the laser's field of vision until the missile hits, but you don't have to fly directly at it. In my own experience, the laser-guided missiles are easier to use, but it's still pretty clunky. In air battles, none of these weapons do anywhere near enough damage to really be viable, and in ground battles flying close air support, they end up being very difficult to use effectively. The problem is, at BR-11, you're up against modern air defenses, and if you spend more than a second or two tunnel visioned into the TV sensor or the laser, you're probably going to get shot down. With the laser-guided missiles, you can't really zoom in as far as I would like, which ends up making it difficult to hit targets at standoff ranges. And if you get in too close, you're sandbait. Now, I suppose with a fair amount of practice, it's possible to get good at using the TV and laser-guided weapons on the MiG-27, but unless you've got a buddy on the ground who can spot some targets for you, it's going to be quite difficult to find what you want to shoot at. Honestly, in my opinion, it's because of how they implemented the view and targeting controls, not because of any problems with the plane or the weapons. You're just fighting the interface. For air-to-air weapons, the MiG-27 has a couple of credible missiles. You get the R-13M1, which is a rear aspect IR missile with comparatively good range, and you get the R-60M, which is an all-aspect updated version of the regular R-60. The R-13M1 is a good missile, and it'll serve you well while you're upgrading the plane. But once you can unlock the loadouts with the 4 R-60s, the MiG-27 becomes a lot more effective in air combat. Because they're all-aspect weapons, you can lock without needing to get a good angle on the engine exhaust of the target. So you can lock up and fire at targets flying at oblique forward angles or even head-on passes. The downside is that the MiG-27 doesn't have any radar at BR 11.0. So when you're out on a mission, you're literally flying blind, and you'll have to rely on your teammates for detection beyond visual ranges. Since you only have IR missiles and air-to-ground weapons, the lack of a radar isn't as crippling as it would be in a dedicated fighter, but I still felt kinda naked without it in top-tier matches. This leads to a difficult topic: taking the MiG-27 out into actual gameplay. The developers made a decision with this plane that, in my opinion, seriously handicaps its utility in the current game modes. The MiG-27 is a jet designed for ground attack out in real life, has a huge selection of loadouts full of air-to-ground weapons, carries multiple types of guided air-to-ground missiles, and even the new TV-guided bombs. But they classified it as a fighter. so when RB matches, you start back on the runway. If there are any F4s with bombs or something like that Italian F-104 ground attacker, your teammates are all going to beat you to the targets, and you might end up having to scavenge. Plus, you're going to be quite vulnerable to interception. Very vulnerable. In addition to lacking radar, you only have a bare minimum quantity of countermeasures. The promo videos for this patch showed the Mig-27 dumping this huge load of flares and dodging SAMs and all that cool stuff, but what they didn't show you was that you're completely out of the flares if you do that. So if someone takes a second shot, you're basically done. We end up with a situation where the plane's weapons are heavily suited for ground attack, but the mission setups put you in a position where you're going to get sucked into dogfights more often than not. And even though you have decent short-range missiles, the plane will be outturned by pretty much everything else at this BR most of the time. And when, not if, you run out of countermeasures, you're going to be in a bad spot. This is a recipe for frustration, and really head-on merges are the only place the MiG-27 actually shines in air combat. I spent a lot of time in-game trying to find a reliable way to use this plane, and honestly, I couldn't find anything. It feels like Gaijin set the MiG-27 up deliberately for failure, so it would be less useful in air battles and more useful as a close air support in ground battles, but the interface for the weapons is clunky enough where it isn't good as close air support, at least not as good as it should be. In a plane this advanced, the dumb bomb loadouts shouldn't be your best weapon in any situation, never mind a lot of the time. In terms of flight performance, the MiG-27 flies about like you'd expect, similar to the MiG-23 with a lower top-end speed. You can control the variable geometry wings manually, or you can leave it on automatic. If you get good at thinking a few seconds ahead, manually handling the wind sweep can, help you a little bit in dogfights, but honestly, the fractional performance boost it gives you isn't worth the chance of screwing it up. Just leave it on automatic most of the time. The landing performance of the MiG-27 is excellent, and this is one of the situations where you want to use the manual wing sweep. You can fully unsweep the wings and deploy landing flaps manually once you slow down. And then you've got a drag chute. So, not bad. The visuals on the MiG-27 are pretty good. There are only 2 skins, neither of them is really noteworthy, and I was honestly kind of hopeful for a Sri Lanka skin. But the cockpit looks great, and you even get the monitor for your TV-guided weapons. Pretty cool. So to wrap up with the MiG-27, the plane carries a huge variety of weapons, including standoff missiles and the new TV-guided bombs, as well as decent air-to-air heat seekers. The GSH-630 cannon is basically Godzilla's atomic fire breath, and the advanced weapons are highly accurate when you can get them to work how you want. On the other hand, this plane suffers a chronic lack of countermeasures. It's horribly positioned in the air battles meta. Its usefulness in ground battles is going to depend heavily on the map and how many anti-air units are on the other team. Its advanced weapons are very difficult to learn and even harder to master, and it doesn't have a radar at BR 11.0. The final verdict on the Mig-27M is that I just couldn't find a use for it. The targeting interface for the smart weapons is just too cumbersome, and it takes too much focused attention to operate in the heat of battle. It's a cool plane, but not useful in the game as currently implemented. I really hope they fix this and streamline the smart weapons. As always, thanks for watching.